Welkom bij de Kast van Clio, de uitzending waarbij we stilstaan bij geschiedenisboeken en bij de auteurs van geschiedenisboeken. En ik ben uw gastheer Harry de Papen. Dit keer had ik een gesprek met niemand minder dan Michael Pye, de auteur van Antwerpen, de gloriejaren. Ik had met hem een zeer boeiend gesprek via Zoom. Good morning, Michael Pye. Thank you for joining our show. And we're going to talk about your most recent book, Antwerp, The Glory Years. It's been a marvelous read, by the way. Yeah, the city was really an exception in its time. It's very apparent. The fact that Thomas More uses it as the starting point of Utopia says a lot, doesn't it?
It does. It's where you went to pick up stories.
Yeah.
It's where you went to find out about things,
Yeah.
whether you were a spy or whether you were Thomas More. And
Yeah.
mind you, he was at the time a diplomat, so he may have had secret missions, who knows?
Yeah, could be an intriguing story. Now, there seems to be a golden triangle for Antwerp. If I'm not mistaken, was mud, regulation, and markets. That was the golden triangle for the success of Antwerp, wasn't it?
Well, yes, first of all, they had to deal with Bruges, of course. I mean, Bruegel had to be out of the way. Otherwise, without that, it would have been much more difficult. But Bruegel managed to shoot itself in the foot again and again. I mean, one way to alienate a would-be emperor is to imprison him in the town with a good view of his associates being executed on the main square. This is tactless, to put it mildly. It was also true that the main passageways, water passageways into Bruegel were beginning to silt up. So yes, mud was very important. But what really made Antwerp successful was something much more cunning. It was the twice-a-year trade fairs, which sort of expanded. And the beauty of that was that when you got to travel a long distance in order to buy things and sell things, it helped a lot to know exactly when you should go and exactly where. And that, with Antwerp and also Bergen-op-Zoom, those markets really made a huge difference. And after a while, Bruegel starts complaining that there's no business going on while the fairs are on in Antwerp. And they then realize that, well, all the money people from Bruegel seem to have gone to Antwerp to set up their offices there. And the transition begins.
And the regulations, Bruegel was over-regulated. That was a problem for Bruegel, wasn't it?
Well, yes, but it also had this classic problem with what people always talk about Antwerp and Flanders. But in fact, what really mattered was that Flanders was in Brabant.
Mm-hmm.
It was in a different kind of atmosphere of regulation and so forth. And what's more, Antwerp didn't have to protect its own producers. The goods that were sold in Antwerp were goods that were going through. They came from somewhere else. They went to somewhere else. Yeah. And that made an enormous amount of difference. It was a place of transit. The only thing that stayed in Antwerp was the deals and the profit.
Yeah. And despite the fact not having a court, not having a bishop and all that, it still became a success.
Well, that must have been a huge advantage. Mm-hmm. I mean, the argument for not having a bishop in Antwerp, as you know, went on and on, refusing to have a bishop. No, we don't really want one of those. Thank you very much indeed. It was basically to do with the fact that the bishop would bring in the Inquisition. The bishop would give authority and weight to going after all the heretics on whom Antwerp's entire fortune depended.
Yeah, because you talk about, of course, the 16th century war, the religious war that starts in the Low Countries, but Antwerp was rather exempt of that for a long time, wasn't it? It kept out of that conflict for a long time.
And the wars turned up outside their walls from time to time, as they did in 1542. But, you know, absolutely, they managed to create an atmosphere in which people got on with their own business, their own faith, and their own practice. And it wasn't at all a secular city. I mean, this is a city with regular processions of the sacraments. This is a city which was of apparently profound Catholic devotion. Yeah. But somehow it managed to not interfere with everybody else.
Yeah. Now, your book starts around the year 1500 when the first Portuguese ships arrive in the city, and it ends approximately around 1566, the iconoclastic storm, the Beeldenstorm in Dutch, or maybe 1585, the fall of Antwerp. So it's a very short period of time that Antwerp has this huge success. So it was like a rocket launching and then declining again in a very rapid period of time. How was this possible?
Oh, well, the fact that Madrid was otherwise occupied I mean, Charles V wished to go elsewhere and beat up heretics, which he did extensively throughout Germany, and that distracted him enough from the business of actually oppressing Antwerp. The other thing was that Antwerp was so useful. You can afford to, if you think of it as a free port, which of course it wasn't technically, but if you think of it as free ports are now, you can tolerate what goes on in free ports because they're so useful for everything else. And Antwerp was somewhere that Charles V could go to find money when he couldn't find it anywhere else.
Yeah. Now, at the end, at the beginning of the decline of the city, there's a very interesting painting in your book. It's called The Vleestal by Pieter Bruegel. It's this painting here where you see a meat stall. And it's in fact an allegory for the decline of the city, isn't it?
I think so, yes. If you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that little white board. It actually talks about one particular land deal. And the particular land deal was one which inevitably Gilbert and Schoenbecker made, but then he made most of the land deals that were going on at the time. No, it's really an emblem of Antwerp. If you look at the picture fairly closely, there are lots of things that only make sense in that assumption. The little references to the coats of arms of Antwerp, the fact that the Virgin in the panel at the back of the picture is riding away, but is also giving bread or money to somebody who's begging. And none of these things have any biblical authority, but they have a lot to do with the processions about the sorrows of the Virgin Mary that went on in Antwerp regularly. The whole thing is, I think, about the idea of a ramshackle Antwerp, a falling apart Antwerp. And it did lack central authority. It could be unbelievably corrupt. I mean, if you wanted to build a new quarter of Antwerp, your first job was to find out precisely how many gold coins and precisely how much jewelry various mayors needed, and to identify the right mayors to give the right jewels to. And once you've done that, you could get on with revising the whole city. No, it's a falling apart place. And Edson is interesting because he came from Amsterdam. And soon after painting this picture, he went back to Amsterdam. It's his comment, I think, on the place which had done very well by him for a long time, but which he begins to feel is just falling apart in a way that people can't any longer live with.
There's another painting which I find very interesting in your book, and it's a painting of a lady, a self-portrait, Catharina van Hemesen. And she's a very interesting figure, isn't she? Because she's a woman.
She's one of the heroes of the book. I mean, this is supposed to be, and I'm not enough of an art historian to know whether it's really true, the first known self-portrait of an artist at work. This is amazing because Catalina should not have been an artist. Only men could enter the St. Luke's Guild. But she followed her father into painting, and she painted very successfully. I mean, she went to Mechelen and produced a whole gallery of portraits of women of the age. It's quite astonishing in a way. But her courage, and I think when you look at that picture and you look at the eyes and that face, it's just I am not taking any nonsense at all. I know what I want to do and I am going to do it.
Yes,
she's giving
that look. She's giving that look. By the way, it's a topic that keeps appearing up in your books, like the one on the North Sea. You talk about the powerful women that lived around these parts. It seems to be a feature of the Low Countries to have strong women.
Absolutely. It's what everybody noticed. I mean, they noticed it in all sorts of different ways. You get Venetian visitors who come and who say, you can tell a dirty joke in front of a woman. Unthinkable. Or alternatively, you get people who notice that women are in business. And they were. I mean, they were in almost every business. There were women surgeons, there were women in marine insurance, there were women doing all sorts of jobs where they had to actually decide for themselves what they wanted to do, find the capital to do it, and get on with it. And they did successfully. And in part, I think it's a very simple, in a way, not explanation, but an explanation for what made this possible, which is that people on the whole married later in the Low Countries. Girls in Italian city-states were under pressure to marry early and get all those big issues like dowry and so on sorted out. Not so in the Low Countries. They had time and they had time to do other things for a period, to have a sort of life of their own, on their own behalf. And it worked for women and it also worked for men. I mean, men were able to go away and to learn new techniques. And for example, in the end, one of the things that brought windmills to England was the fact that men from Flanders had all this time to travel and to bring their techniques with them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we owe you quite a lot.
Yeah. I know all those weavers and all that that influx into England. I know. Now, how did you come about creating this book? How did this idea start to write a book on Antwerp?
Well, when I was finishing The Edge of the World, the book ends in Antwerp, effectively. It ends with this phenomenon, this new idea of a city growing on the side of the North Sea. And it's a city which doesn't depend on a bishop or a lord. It's a city which thinks it has its own rights and its own interests, and it's going to pursue them. And that I thought was fascinating. I then looked around and thought, there's wonderful detailed scholarship on Antwerp in this period, brilliant stuff. But nobody's pulling it together. I then was at a dinner party with a very, very senior Dutch professor of history who said to me, "You're writing a book about Antwerp? Not possible, there's nothing left there." And I thought, well, this can't be totally true. But it is true that the archives of Antwerp were in the town hall that was burnt by the Spanish Fury in 1576 by the very hungry and very unpaid Spanish troops. So there's definitely a gap in doing the ordinary civic history for this period. So what I thought was, well, okay, I'm a foreigner writing about Antwerp. Make a virtue of that. Look at what foreigners wrote and thought about Antwerp during this period. Because apart from anything else, foreigners actually have to explain things to the people back home. You know, they have to go into detail about how it works and what they can, often they're saying what we can and we can't do because of how it works. And this turned out to be a wonderful idea because it leads you straight to the Venetian ambassadors who are recording with a quite fair amount of jealousy and occasionally a bit of spite exactly what's going on in Antwerp. You go to Zurich, and in the records of some of the great Protestant pastors, they're worrying about Antwerp. They're worrying about their connections through Antwerp. They're worrying about how people are doing. You go to any of the Lisbon archives or the Seville archives, and you have much the same. And you have the same in London as well. I mean, London, after all, was getting its guns and a lot of its money from Antwerp. And London really wanted to know what was happening. And it was recorded in proper detail and how it worked.
Yeah. Well, could you say there's a renewed interest in the history of the Low Countries? You've got your book, you've got The Edge of the World, the other book that you wrote. You have The Burgundians now that has become a big success in the English-speaking world, written by Bart Fallot. Is there a renewed interest in our history?
I don't think it ever really went away. I mean, I belong to a generation which was at university in the 60s. And then it was assumed that you couldn't do English history without the history of the Low Countries, which is roughly speaking true. I mean, if you're talking about anything from armies to Reformation theology, it was all done between the two countries along the way. I think what's happening is that there was a moment of fashionability with embarrassment of riches, tremendous fashionability, and suddenly people were actually saying, "My God, we don't know anything about this. We ought to." And it's suddenly occurring to people, this is actually a very important story. And it's very often the story that makes sense of all the other stories. I mean, if you think, for example, of what everybody's different ideas of starting an empire, the Dutch stand out as the absolute exception. I mean, you don't go abroad to live. In fact, there are pamphlets in the 17th century complaining that you don't go abroad to live. You just wish people would stay put for a bit. So you end up with places like Batavia, which are basically Chinese trading towns with a Dutch garrison. This is extraordinary because it's so much against the Portuguese notion that whole populations could move to live in Brazil, or indeed the English notion that people would go abroad, settle, for their own religious reasons, for their own social reasons. So actually, sometimes, if you start looking at it from a Low Countries perspective, you get a different story, and you see the story that seems familiar in a different way. And that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, you've written a very fascinating book. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah, you have. So thank you very much for your time. And I really enjoyed our talk. I really enjoyed reading the book, and I really would advise everyone to read it.
Oh,
So,
wonderful. Well, thank you very much for having me.
you're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Good.